Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. It was in the chill of an unusually barren March that the affair of the keys to nowhere first presented itself to Holmes and me. London wore its late winter face with an aspect both dreary and untrustworthy. Smoke hung low across Baker Street, and the lamplighters had taken to their work early, as if conceding daylight was not worth preserving. Holmes had been in one of his restless moods for several days, pacing before the fire, his violin laid untouched upon the table. It was in such moments that I feared most for his mind, for the absence of a problem was for him a deprivation as keen as hunger. Relief came, oddly enough, in the form of a nervous clerk who rang our bell close upon the evening hour. The man was of slight build, his fingers ink-stained, his manner deferential, yet his eyes darted about the room with an agitation that betrayed more than his timid speech conveyed. He gave his name as Mr. Harold Fletcher, an assistant in the service of Mr. Lionel Graves, a reclusive but wealthy manufacturer who resided on the northern edge of the city. "Mr. Holmes," he began, glancing once at me as though unsure of my discretion, "I come on a matter that has unsettled my master beyond description. A theft has occurred in his household, though how it was contrived I cannot for the life of me imagine." At this, Holmes leaned forward, his long fingers steepled, his gaze fixed in that hawk-like manner which rendered the bravest tongue suddenly candid. "Pray do not hesitate. State the facts as plainly as you can." Fletcher swallowed. "Sir, 3 nights past Mr. Graves locked away a set of 6 brass keys in a bureau within his private study. They were of no monetary value, but of great importance to him, so much so that he kept them under watch as another might guard a jewel. Each key is peculiar in its make, for they fit no lock in his house, nor any lock known to his smith. He has long called them his keys to nowhere, and yet he values them as though they were treasure." "Go on," said Holmes. "The bureau was secured, the room locked, and the window fastened with an iron bar. The following morning, when Mr. Graves unlocked the bureau, the drawer was empty. The keys had vanished, no mark of force, no disturbance in the room, nothing whatever to suggest intrusion. It is as though they dissolved into air." Holmes's lips curved in that rare smile of his, the smile not of amusement, but of recognition when the world dared present him with a puzzle worthy of his mind. "An object of importance vanishes from a sealed chamber," he murmured. "And the object is not merely strange, but apparently purposeless. Curious indeed." I confess I felt my own intrigue sharpening. The theft of valuables I had encountered often enough, but to risk exposure for 6 keys that unlock nothing, this was the sort of eccentricity that marked a case destined for my friend's peculiar genius. "Who else resides in the household?" Holmes inquired. "Mr. Graves himself, his widowed sister, Mrs. Eleanor Ashcombe, 2 maidservants, a cook, and myself. None else." The constable who examined the scene declared it insoluble, suggesting perhaps Mr. Graves had misplaced the keys and forgotten where. "But, sir, I have served him 6 years, and never have I known him to mislay so much as a coin." "And Mr. Graves's state of mind?" "Most unsettled. He has grown irritable, even fearful. He believes the theft deliberate, intended not for gain, but for menace. He begged me to come to you, Mr. Holmes, for he swears the very safety of his household depends upon the return of those keys." Holmes rose and reached for his coat with the sudden animation of a man recalled to life. "Watson," he said, his eyes alight, "we must not delay. It is not every day that a thing without value is stolen with the caution one reserves for a crown jewel. That paradox alone is enough to suggest there is more here than meets the eye. Ready yourself. We shall call upon Mr. Graves without loss of time." Thus began the affair which, though it opened, with so trifling an object as 6 forgotten keys, grew into one of the most perplexing and sinister mysteries it was ever my lot to chronicle. Chapter 2. Holmes and the Puzzling Keys. The hansom rattled northward through streets that glistened with the residue of the day's rain, and I could not help but observe the quickened vigour that had come over my companion. Holmes sat opposite me, his long frame folded with an ease that belied the keen restlessness of his mind. His eyes, bright and contemplative, fixed not upon the passing lamps, but upon some inner vision. I knew the look well enough. The case had already seized his faculties, and he was working silently through its angles. "You were struck by the oddity of the object, no doubt," I ventured, hoping to provoke one of his illuminating discourses. "Indeed, Watson, 6 keys that open no doors, yet worth enough to someone that they risk detection to obtain them. A paradox is the first scent of truth. Consider what that tells us. If the keys hold no material value, their significance must be abstract, symbolic, perhaps, or practical, in some form concealed to ordinary eyes. You think, then, that their uselessness is itself an illusion?" Holmes inclined his head. "Precisely. To label an object useless is generally a declaration of ignorance, not fact. Why should a man of Graves' intelligence preserve such things unless he knew their purpose? Why guard them so carefully? It is the behaviour of a man who perceives value where others cannot. The thief, therefore, either shares in that knowledge or has sought to acquire it." I found myself unsettled. But what value could lie in keys that fit no locks? Holmes's lips twitched in a faint smile. "That, my dear fellow, is the melody yet to be played. Keys without locks may point to locks without keys, or perhaps to secrets that disguise themselves as absurdities. In crime, as in life, the apparent nonsense is often the truest signal." We turned into a quieter quarter of the city. The fog had thickened, and the horses' hooves struck an echo upon the cobblestones. I was struck by the silence between us, though in Holmes's silence there was always more communication than in most men's speech. He drew his notebook from his pocket and jotted 3 words: symbol, access, fear. He underlined the last twice. "You noted Fletcher's phrase," Holmes remarked suddenly. "The safety of his household depends upon the return of the keys." Curious? Safety from what? A burglary? An intrusion? Or something subtler, an exposure, perhaps, of matters Mr. Graves would rather keep veiled? I recalled the clerk's pale face and restless eyes. He seemed convinced the matter bore menace. Then menace there is. For an honest clerk does not employ such language unless he has seen the shadow behind the curtain. That alone warrants haste. Presently we drew up before the residence of Mr. Graves. The house stood stern and dark against the fog, its windows shuttered, its stonework blackened with soot. An iron fence ran about the property, its gate shut fast. There was an austerity about the place, as though its very bricks resented intrusion. Holmes surveyed it keenly as we approached. "Note, Watson, no signs of disorder about the grounds, no indication of forced entry, yet the thief must either have gained access from without or been present within. A problem of boundaries and therefore of opportunity." We were admitted by Fletcher himself, who had waited anxiously at the door. He ushered us into a hall dimly lit by a single oil lamp, where the faint smell of polish hung in the air. From somewhere above came the slow tread of footsteps, heavy and measured, as though the master of the house carried his burdens with him from room to room. "Mr. Graves awaits you in the study," Fletcher murmured. "He has scarcely slept since the keys disappeared. You will find him greatly unsettled." As we climbed the staircase, Holmes's hand brushed my sleeve. He inclined his head toward the stair carpet. "Observe, Where to the left edge, not the right. A man pacing in thought along his return path. A habit of restless agitation. Clark spoke true of his master's distress. I could not but marvel at his acuity. You draw such a conclusion from a strip of worn fabric? From that, and from the sound of his tread, each step is weighted not by fatigue but by thought. Graves is a man consumed by an anxiety he dares not yet name aloud. We shall hear it soon enough. When at last we were shown into the study, I beheld a chamber of sober furnishings, shelves of ledgers, a heavy desk, and a bureau of dark oak set against the far wall. Before the hearth stood Mr. Lionel Graves himself, a tall man, grey at the temples, with a countenance that betrayed sleepless vigils and a spirit gnawed by suspicion. His eyes, sharp and weary both, fixed upon us as though clinging to a last resort. "Mr. Holmes," he said in a voice low yet resonant, "you come in time, for I swear to you this theft is but the herald of something darker. If these keys are not recovered, I fear the very ruin of my house." Holmes inclined his head with grave courtesy. "Then you have done wisely in sending for me, Mr. Graves. You may trust that nothing, however strange, will be beyond examination, but I must insist, you tell me plainly all you know of these curious keys, and why their absence troubles you so profoundly." The fire cracked in the grate, casting long shadows upon the walls. In that moment I felt the case deepen around us, like water closing over a man who had only just stepped from the shore. Chapter 3. A Scene of Deception. Mr. Lionel Graves stood before us with a rigidity that spoke as much of pride as of fear. His face was lined not only by years but by nights of unrest, and though his attire was immaculate, there was an air of disarray about the man, as though his very composure had been hastily buttoned over some deeper fracture. Holmes, ever the master of first impressions, regarded him with a calm that seemed to invite confidence without demanding it. "You must see for yourselves," Graves said at last. He turned, gesturing to the bureau set against the far wall. It was a heavy piece of oak, its brass fittings polished to a dull glow. Graves crossed to it with deliberate steps, unlocked the upper drawer, and pulled it wide. Within lay nothing but the faint imprint of objects once resting there. The dust disturbed in 6 parallel spaces where the keys had been. "I placed them here myself," Graves declared. "At 10:30 on the night of the 23rd, I locked this drawer, locked the study door, and kept the key upon my watch chain. When I returned at 8 the next morning, the drawer was empty. No damage to the lock, no sign of entry. Empty!" His voice cracked upon the word, and he sank heavily into a chair, his fingers trembling against his knee. Holmes advanced with the keen absorption of a naturalist presented with a rare specimen. He bent over the drawer, his gaze tracing each corner with such intensity that the silence of the room deepened. He produced his magnifying lens and for several minutes examined the brass lock, the interior lining, and the faint scratches upon the wood. "Watson, note the regularity of the impressions," he murmured. 6 keys, each resting at a precise angle, as though their owner took pleasure in order. The hand that removed them, however, disturbed this dust more broadly than necessary. A hurried hand, though one still careful to avoid noise. I leaned closer, though my eyes could discern little more than a grey blur. And yet the lock, no scratches, no force employed. Just so. This is the crux of the deception. The drawer yields no sign of tampering, which suggests either a key identical to the master's or the master's own. Graves bristled. "You do not imply that I—" Holmes raised a hand. "I imply nothing as yet. Facts, sir, precede conclusions. You alone possess the key." "Yes, here." He produced a small iron key upon his chain. Holmes examined it swiftly, returned it without remark, and proceeded to the door of the study. The door was stout, its lock firm. Holmes turned it back and forth, his ear close to the mechanism. Then he moved to the window, testing the iron bar that ran across it. He tapped the screws with his knuckle, tugged lightly, and finally shook his head. Secure. No ingress here. All the while, Graves watched with a feverish anxiety. You see the impossibility of it, and yet the keys are gone. Holmes moved slowly about the chamber, pausing at the hearth, the shelves, and the writing desk. His gaze lingered upon the carpet near the bureau, where he crouched and inspected a patch scarcely larger than a coin. Ah, mud, faint, but recent. Someone stood here who had come in from without, though not drenched by rain. A quick step only. Fletcher, who else entered this room that night or the morning after? No one, sir. I myself fetched Mr. Graves when he called me at breakfast. The maids have not touched this chamber for over a week, by his instruction. Holmes' eyes narrowed, though his tone remained light. Curious, and the mud tells us more than words. Someone entered briefly, yet left no other trace. That is deception indeed, Watson, an absence masquerading as truth. For a long moment, the fire's crackle filled the silence. Then Graves spoke, his voice strained. Mr. Holmes, you must understand, the keys are no trinkets. They belong to my late father, who guarded them as I have done. He never spoke of their use, only that they must never leave our possession. I know not what lock they fit, nor what secret they protect, but I fear that their theft is meant to bring calamity upon me, perhaps upon us all. Holmes turned toward him, his face unreadable. Secrets, Mr. Graves, have a way of drawing pursuers even when their holders do not comprehend them. I must ask you to withhold nothing. Were there disputes in your household? Any visitor who might have seen these keys? Graves hesitated, and in that hesitation I saw the flicker of something unspoken, fear perhaps, or shame. My sister has seen them, yes. She considers my attachment folly, beyond that, none. Holmes inclined his head gravely. Then it is to your sister we shall next apply our questions. For now, Watson, observe, a theft without sign, a room without entry, and keys without purpose. Each is an enigma, but together they form a pattern most deliberate. The crime deceives by its very impossibility. As we departed the study, I could not shake the sense that we had stepped into a hall of mirrors, where every surface promised truth, yet only reflected further uncertainty. Chapter 4. The gathering of suspects. Mrs. Eleanor Ashcombe received us in the drawing-room with a composure that contrasted sharply with her brother's agitation. She was a woman of middle years, her features fine and severe, with a bearing that suggested command rather than consolation. Her attire was simple but elegant, and though she welcomed us with courtesy, there lingered about her a coolness that kept sympathy at arm's length. "My brother has exaggerated, no doubt," she said, as she poured tea into delicate china. "The loss of these trinkets, however mysterious, is scarcely cause to summon London's most renowned detective. Keys, Mr. Holmes, are plentiful. One can always have another set made." Holmes regarded her with that mild expression I had learned to dread on behalf of others. It was the mask behind which he stored his sharpest assessments. "You speak of their practical form, madam," he replied smoothly. "But your brother maintains they carry weight beyond function. You do not share his conviction?" Her lips thinned. "I share his anxieties far too often, Mr. Holmes. Lionel has lived half his life with shadows that others do not see. These keys, odd little things, were our father's keepsake. Lionel inherited not only the objects, but the dread attached to them. That dread has governed this house more than once. I noted the flicker in Graves's eye at her words, but he said nothing, his hands tightening upon the arm of his chair. Holmes, meanwhile, stirred his tea with a contemplative air. And yet Mrs. Ashcombe, objects inspire dread only when they are connected to power, memory, or guilt. To which of these do you ascribe your brother's attachment? She met his gaze evenly. Memory, perhaps. Our father was a secretive man. He impressed upon us that these keys must not be lost, though he never spoke their use. My brother has preserved that command as though it were a commandment. Holmes let the silence hang, studying her as though weighing the grain of her words against the tone of her voice. At length he nodded, then turned to Fletcher. You, sir, have been long in Mr. Graves's service. Tell me, do these keys excite in you the same reverence they do in your master? The clerk started, clearly unprepared to be called upon, his thin hands clasped and unclasped nervously. I only know what I've been told, sir. They were kept as though sacred. I never dared touch them. But I cannot deny I have wondered often why they were watched so closely when their purpose was unknown. Holmes gave a small, satisfied hum, then glanced to the doorway, where the rustle of skirts announced another figure. A young maid entered, her face flushed from hurrying. She curtsied awkwardly. "This is Anna," Fletcher explained. "She tends to the upper rooms." Holmes beckoned, her gently closer. "Anna, were you in this study the day before or the day after the keys were lost?" The girl shook her head quickly. "No, sir. Mr. Graves keeps that room closed. We do not clean it unless told. But I saw light there, late at night. The door was shut, but a line of it came under, like from a candle." Graves straightened sharply. "Why was I not told of this?" The maid's voice quavered. "I feared it was you, sir, and thought no more." Holmes's eyes glittered. "And when was this?" "The night before the keys were gone. Near midnight." Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. "So the study was not as inviolate as we thought. We must take note, Watson." Before more could be pressed, another voice intruded, rich with warmth, though edged with fatigue. A stout woman in apron and cap entered, balancing a tray. "Beg pardon, but supper is ready," she said. This, I took, must be Mrs. Partridge, the cook. She cast a glance about the room, her eyes lingering a fraction too long on her master's troubled face. Holmes engaged her at once. "You are long in this house, madam?" 20 years, sir." "And in that time, have you known the keys to stir such alarm before?" Her brow furrowed. "Only when the master's father lived. He was secretive about them too, locked them away, then checked thrice that they were still there. Drove the mistress near mad with it." Holmes nodded gravely, as though filing away a piece of an unfinished mosaic. He rose, brushing an invisible fleck from his sleeve. "Mr. Graves, your household is rich in memories and wary glances. I must ask to speak with each servant alone, and in turn, if you will allow, for the thief, whether in this house or beyond, cannot conceal forever the hand that reached into your most private drawer." The request was met with uneasy silence. Graves' face darkened, his sister's eyes narrowed, and Fletcher swallowed hard. Yet after a long moment, Graves inclined his head. "Very well, Mr. Holmes, you shall have access to all." As we withdrew, I felt the net of suspicion draw tight about every figure we had encountered. Each face bore its own shadow, the austere sister, the anxious clerk, the timid maid, the watchful cook. I could not know which shadow concealed guilt, but I knew Holmes had already measured them with the accuracy of a surgeon feeling the pulse of his patient. Chapter 5. The first suspects, the following morning, broke pale and colourless, the fog clinging so tightly to the windows that the garden beyond seemed swallowed in ash. Holmes had requested each member of the household in turn, and we began with the one whose nervousness seemed least capable of withstanding scrutiny. Harold Fletcher sat opposite us in the study, his hands clasped upon his knees, his voice low and hesitant. "I have told you all, Mr. Holmes. I alone unlocked the study when my master called me that morning. I swear no other soul entered before that moment." Holmes paced slowly before the hearth, his hands thrust deep into his pockets. "And yet," he said in a tone of mild curiosity, "you admit you have long wondered about the significance of the keys. Curiosity is a powerful master, Mr. Fletcher. You would not be the first clerk to overstep a boundary out of temptation to uncover a secret." The colour drained from Fletcher's face. "Sir, I swear upon my life I never touched them. I may have wondered, yes, but to betray my master's trust, never!" Holmes wheeled suddenly, his gaze sharp as a blade. "Then how do you account for the trace of mud upon the carpet, mud from a boot smaller than your master's?" "A boot of your size, perhaps," Fletcher stammered, his words tripping over one another. I cannot say, but it was not mine. I polished my boots that very night. You may examine them if you wish. I swear I never entered this room after it was locked." I could not help but feel pity for the man. His terror was too unfeigned to be wholly assumed. Yet Holmes gave no sign of relenting. He examined the clerk's shoes when they were produced, gleaming, well-kept, and free of the soil he had indicated. Holmes replaced them without comment and dismissed Fletcher with a curt nod. "Fear is a net that tangles the innocent as readily as the guilty," Holmes remarked when the man had gone. Still, his agitation served its purpose. "It is not Fletcher, I suspect, not yet, but the pressure revealed useful truths. Note, Watson, his instinctive horror at the thought of betrayal. That is the reflex of loyalty, not guilt." Next came Anna, the maid whose observation of the midnight light had stirred our interest. She entered timidly, twisting the hem of her apron. Holmes regarded her with a gentleness that was all the more striking after his severity with Fletcher. "You saw light beneath the study door," he began softly. "Describe it carefully." "It was a thin line, sir, as from a candle, flickering, not steady. I thought perhaps the master could not sleep." "And you did not enter to see?" "No, sir. It is not my place." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "But you are certain of the night? You mistake neither the day nor the hour?" "I am sure, sir. I had risen for a draught of water. The kitchen clock had just struck 12. Holmes tapped his fingers lightly against his chin. "And you told no one?" "No, sir. I feared to speak wrongly." Holmes allowed her to go, then turned to me. "It is notable, Watson. Fletcher was easily shaken, but this girl clung to her story without faltering. A candle burned in the study at midnight, though Graves swore the door was locked and the room untouched. Someone entered, or someone already within, stirred the flame. Finally, we summoned Mrs. Partridge, the cook. She bustled in with the air of one too accustomed to command her kitchen to be daunted by Holmes's reputation. "If you ask me," she declared, folding her arms, "the whole business is nonsense. Keys that do nothing. I've no patience for it." Holmes inclined his head. "Yet nonsense that has produced fear. Did you hear anything unusual that night?" "Only the floorboards creaking above me. This house is old. It sings to itself." "Whose room lies above the study?" "Mrs. Ashcombe's," she answered bluntly. At this, Holmes's eyes lit with an interest that he concealed almost at once. "And you, Mrs. Partridge, you never entered this chamber?" "Never, sir. I've enough to do without meddling in mysteries." When she had departed, I could restrain myself no longer. "Holmes, surely you cannot suspect Mrs. Ashcombe? Her manner may be cold, but she is his sister." Holmes smiled faintly. Blood, my dear Watson, is no guarantee of harmony. The cook's testimony places her above the study the very night a candle glowed within. That does not condemn her, but it compels us to consider the possibility. And note her own words yesterday, dismissing the keys as trifles. Such contempt may mask familiarity. But Fletcher, the mud on the carpet. A red herring, Watson. I pressed him only to gauge his loyalty. His shoes were clean, his terror genuine. No, the answer lies higher, both literally and figuratively. We must watch Mrs. Ashcombe closely. As Holmes spoke, I saw in his eyes the glimmer of anticipation that came when the pieces of a puzzle began to align. Yet to me the pattern remained clouded, each suspect cloaked in equal measure of suspicion and innocence. The household was a stage, and though the curtain had lifted, the true drama was only beginning to reveal itself. Chapter 6. A hidden inconsistency. The day passed in a slow drizzle, the house drawn into a silence that seemed as watchful as its inhabitants. Holmes spent much of the afternoon in the study, pacing with that peculiar rhythm of his. A pendulum of thought, each step marking the measure of his deductions. I lingered nearby, my eyes roving from the locked window to the immovable bureau, but all appeared as it had before, an ordinary room made extraordinary only by what had vanished within it. At length Holmes stopped abruptly and bent once more over the bureau. He drew his lens across the lock, then along the edge of the drawer. "Curious," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "The scratches here are faint, almost invisible, yet they do not align with the use of the key. They are vertical, Watson, not horizontal. Such marks are not made by a turning motion, but by insertion." "You mean to suggest a second key?" "Precisely, one fashioned crudely enough to graze the metal, yet delicate enough to turn the mechanism. Someone had access not to the master's key, but to its likeness, a copy, Watson, made under watchful eyes." This revelation unsettled me. "But only Graves has ever handled them, by his own account. Who could obtain such a chance?" Holmes' gaze sharpened. "That, my dear fellow, is the inconsistency. Graves insists no hand but his has touched these keys. Yet Mrs. Ashcombe declared yesterday that she has seen them often, which is true. If she has seen them, she might have handled them. If not, why claim so? Contradiction, Watson, is the soil in which truth germinates." We were summoned shortly thereafter to the dining room, where the household gathered for a subdued supper. The atmosphere was strained. Fletcher sat stiff-backed, his eyes darting from master to mistress. Anna moved silently at the sideboard, her hands clumsy with nervousness, and Mrs. Ashcombe presided with her customary poise, her gaze cool upon all. Holmes allowed the silence to stretch before speaking. "Mr. Graves, forgive me if I return to a point already touched upon. You assured me that no one but yourself ever handled the keys, yet your sister informed me that she too had seen them. Which of you speaks accurately?" A flush crept into Graves's cheeks. "I never meant that she had not seen them, only that she has not touched them. Eleanor has never laid a finger upon them, though she has observed me place them in the drawer." Mrs. Ashcombe's eyes gleamed. "I said nothing more than that I had seen them. If you chose to exaggerate, Lionel, the fault is not mine." Holmes's voice remained mild. "Then we are agreed she never touched them? Very well. But consider, Watson, how easily a copy of a key may be made, not from theft of the original, but from mere observation, a glance, a measurement, a craftsman's skill. Such is the art of deception." Graves stiffened, his spoon rattling against his bowl. "Are you suggesting, sir, that my sister—" "I suggest nothing beyond the facts," Holmes interjected smoothly. "But I note the contradiction with care. The meal concluded in silence, tension coiling tighter about the table. When we had returned to the study later that night, Holmes lowered his voice. "You see, Watson, how small inconsistencies shine brighter than bold declarations. A sister who claims to see may indeed have touched. A brother who insists none ever touched may conceal more than pride. Between such narrow lines lies our culprit, or the hand that shields them." I could not help but shiver at the thought. The theft that had seemed an absurd curiosity now carried with it the scent of deliberate cunning. The impossible crime was no mere trick of chance, but a stratagem carefully laid. Holmes settled into his chair, his eyes glittering in the firelight. "We are still in the foothills of this mountain, Watson, but already I hear the faint echo of the summit." Chapter 7. The crime grows stranger. It was near midnight when Holmes stirred suddenly from his chair, his lean form springing to life as though struck by an unseen spark. "Come, Watson," he said, seizing his lantern. "The night air may yield what the daylight concealed. Bring your revolver, though I trust we shall need only the light." We slipped quietly into the corridor, the hush of the house broken only by the creak of the stair. The fog outside pressed so thick against the panes that the glass itself seemed frosted. Holmes led me to the study, where he unlocked the door and motioned me within. "Observe, Watson," he whispered, lowering the lantern to the hearth. The ashes glowed faintly, not wholly dead. "This fire has been stoked since last we left, and yet no one, by Mr. Graves' order, was permitted here." I bent closer. Among the ashes, faint but distinct, lay fragments of blackened paper, scraps of writing charred beyond recognition. Holmes lifted them delicately with his forceps. "Note the edges, torn in haste before burning. Someone destroyed a document here tonight, though they believed the evidence gone. But ash is a poor accomplice, Watson. It preserves even as it consumes." The discovery unsettled me deeply. "Then the theft of the keys is not isolated. It is bound to something greater, something written." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Precisely. A theft without purpose is mere folly, but a theft coupled with destruction, that speaks of design. Someone feared these keys would betray their secret, and so sought to erase the proof." Before I could respond, a floorboard creaked in the passage. Holmes motioned sharply, extinguished the lantern, and pressed us into shadow. A faint light appeared under the door, a candle once more. We heard the handle turn, though the lock held firm. After a moment, the sound retreated. Holmes relit the lantern. "There, Watson, the prowler returns. Bold indeed to attempt entry while we are under this roof. We must remain vigilant." The following morning, Holmes examined the ashes anew by daylight. With extraordinary patience, he pieced together several fragments until faint lines of ink emerged. "See here, Watson, 2 words are still legible: ledger and shipment, nothing more. Yet that is enough to suggest commerce, records, accounts. These are not the fancies of an old man. They are matters of business, perhaps illicit." We carried the fragments to Mr. Graves, who received them with a visible shudder. "I know nothing of ledgers or shipments," he protested. "My trade is in manufacturing, plain and honest. If such words appeared in a paper here, it was not mine." Holmes regarded him steadily. "Then someone within your household used this study as their own, and feared discovery when the keys vanished. You see, sir, the crime grows stranger by the hour. The thief of useless keys is also the destroyer of meaningful papers." Mrs. Ashcombe, summoned to hear the finding, stood with her arms folded, her eyes fixed on the fragments. "And yet you cannot say who burned them. A house of 7 souls cannot be condemned by a few ashes." Holmes bowed slightly. "True, madam. Ashes may whisper, but they do not sing. Not yet. But they point, and I follow. That afternoon, Holmes requested a walk about the grounds. We descended into the garden, where the fog still clung in ragged veils. He examined the soil near the study window, his eyes darting from stone to shrub. At last, he crouched and brushed aside a layer of damp leaves. There, half buried, lay a broken matchstick and the faint outline of a bootprint. "Note the sole, Watson," he said with quiet intensity. "Not the broad step of Graves, nor the light tread of the maid, a narrow heel, sharp-edged, feminine perhaps, but not delicate. Whoever stood here watched that window closely, perhaps even tested the bar. Yet the bar, as you recall, was secure. Another contradiction, and contradictions, as I have said, are the true footprints of guilt." As we returned indoors, I felt the weight of the case press more heavily upon us. It was no longer the theft of odd keys, no longer the eccentric dread of a wealthy recluse. It had become something larger, darker, threads of secrecy woven through business, family, and deceit. Holmes, however, seemed only enlivened. "Stranger and stranger, Watson," he murmured, his eyes alight. "This case is a labyrinth, and we have only just set foot within its winding walls, but already the walls begin to close in." Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. The next morning dawned clearer, though the damp air still clung to the stone walls of the Graves household. Holmes had risen before me, as I discovered when I entered the study to find him already bent over the bureau, arranging 6 small brass rods in neat parallel. "You will observe, Watson," he said, gesturing toward them, "that these rods bear no true resemblance to the stolen keys, yet at a glance they might deceive the unpractised eye. I intend to use them for an experiment, an imitation bait, if you will." "Do you mean to test the thief's courage?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "Not courage, Watson. Impulse. The hand that stole once may be compelled to steal again when it believes itself unobserved. Deception is a creature that cannot resist the lure of repetition." He arranged the rods within the drawer, closed it, and locked it with Graves's key. Then he placed the key upon the desk rather than upon the master's chain. Now the stage is set. We shall see who cannot resist. Throughout the morning, Holmes contrived to bring each member of the household into the study under plausible pretext. Fletcher was summoned to fetch a ledger, Anna to dust the shelves, Mrs. Partridge to deliver a tray. In each instance, Holmes contrived to step out for a moment, leaving the drawer and key temptingly in view. I, concealed with notebook in hand, observed their behaviour. Fletcher cast only a nervous glance toward the bureau, his eyes fixed more on the doorway than the desk. Anna did not so much as look at the key, her cheeks pink with fear of displeasing her master. Mrs. Partridge, however, lingered near the desk longer than necessary, her stout fingers hovering almost imperceptibly above the chain before she withdrew them quickly, muttering about her duties. Holmes returned each time with the same calm expression, as though nothing were amiss. Yet when Mrs. Ashcombe entered at last, summoned on the pretence of signing a household account, I felt a distinct tightening of the air. She approached the desk with perfect composure, her eyes glancing across the key with not a flicker of interest. She signed the paper Holmes provided, placed the pen back with deliberate grace, and left without another word. When the door closed, Holmes exhaled slowly. "Did you note it, Watson? Each soul revealed themselves in the presence of temptation. Fletcher was cowed by loyalty, Anna by timidity, Partridge by curiosity, and Mrs. Ashcombe by indifference. Too perfect, Watson, far too perfect. True indifference does not present itself in such measured form. It was a performance as carefully arranged as any theatre." I frowned. "But how can you be certain? It was feigned." Holmes tapped the desk lightly. because the absence of reaction is itself the loudest reaction, a sister who dismissed the keys as trifles, yet who takes care to show no interest whatsoever when confronted with them, betrays her awareness. In attempting to appear unconcerned, she revealed the very concern she sought to hide. That evening, Holmes confided further as we walked the garden paths. "We must not leap to accusation, Watson. A trap must close at the right moment or the prey escapes. But consider, someone burned papers in that hearth, someone tested the window bar from outside, someone made or obtained a copy of the key. Each thread coils back toward this house, and one hand only is strong enough to tie them together." I could not shake the image of Mrs. Ashcombe's calm face, her eyes cool as glass. Yet I also recalled the maid's frightened whisper of candlelight at midnight, and the broken matchstick outside the study window. The pieces swirled like fragments of a puzzle, their shape still uncertain. Holmes paused at the edge of the lawn, gazing up at the shuttered windows of the house. "Tomorrow, Watson, we shall spring the next stage. For now we have set the bait. Let us see who dares to grasp at shadows." Chapter 9. A second attempt strikes again. It was well after midnight when the second act of this strange drama revealed itself. I had retired early, my mind wearied by Holmes's subtle experiment and the weight of uncertainty it had left behind. Yet I had scarcely fallen into slumber when a firm hand upon my shoulder roused me. "Up, Watson," Holmes whispered urgently, his lantern already lit. "The moth circles the flame. We must be quick, or the flame is extinguished altogether." I dressed hastily and followed him down the corridor. The house was still, the only sound the muted tick of the hall clock and the whisper of the wind at the shutters. Holmes moved with a feline silence, his lantern shaded, his revolver glinting faintly in his other hand. We reached the study door, where he motioned me to halt. From within came the faint scrape of metal against wood. Someone was at the bureau. Holmes turned the key softly, then threw the door open with a suddenness that made me start. The room lay dim, lit only by the red glow of the dying fire. At the bureau crouched a figure clad in shadow, their hand upon the very drawer where Holmes had laid his false keys. At our entrance the intruder sprang upright, the drawer left half open. For an instant I glimpsed a pale face, wide eyes startled with guilt. But before I could act, the figure darted past us with astonishing swiftness, vanishing into the corridor. "After them, Watson," Holmes cried. We gave chase, but the intruder had the advantage of familiarity with the house. We thundered down the stair only to hear the slam of a door and the swift patter of retreating feet upon the garden path. By the time we reached the lawn, the fog had swallowed them whole. Holmes stood rigid, his lantern beams sweeping across the ground. There, upon the damp soil near the hedge, lay evidence enough. A second boot print, sharp and narrow, beside the faint glint of a bent brass rod, the decoy key dropped in flight. "They took the bait," Holmes said grimly. "But note, Watson, that they realized the trick too late. In their haste, they abandoned the false prize." We returned to the study where the bureau stood open. The imitation keys were scattered across the floor, disturbed by hurried hands. Holmes replaced them carefully, his eyes alight with fierce satisfaction. Now we know two things. First, that the thief was indeed within the household, watching for their chance. Second, that the theft of the original keys was no accident of opportunity. This is a campaign, Watson, a deliberate series of acts, growing bolder with each attempt. Graves appeared moments later, roused by the commotion, his sister following in her dressing gown. His face blanched at the sight of the bureau. "They came again? Under my very roof?" "They did," Holmes replied calmly, and with a courage born of desperation. "Yet we must not mistake boldness for victory. Each attempt narrows the circle. Each flight leaves a trace. Already the pattern begins to tighten. Mrs. Ashcombe's gaze flickered to her brother. And what if the pattern leads inward, Lionel? What if the danger lies not beyond our gate, but within these very walls? Holmes's eyes lingered upon her for a moment, unreadable. Then he extinguished his lantern. Rest assured, madam, the danger will reveal itself. Deception cannot long conceal a hand so eager. Watson, we must keep watch more closely than ever. As I returned to my chamber, sleep fled from me. The vision of that startled face haunted me, the pallor, the sudden fear, the swiftness of retreat. Yet, in the fog and the shadows, I could not swear whose features I had seen. And so the crime grew stranger still. Not only a theft without entry, but a thief who dared return beneath the very eyes of Sherlock Holmes. Chapter 10. The True Motive surfaces. The household gathered the following morning under a pall of unease. The attempted intrusion in the night had left every soul restless, and suspicion hung about the breakfast table like the fog beyond the windows. Fletcher scarcely touched his food. Anna kept her gaze lowered. Mrs. Partridge busied herself with clattering dishes, and Mrs. Ashcombe sat rigid, her lips pressed in a line of disdain. Mr. Graves, pale and hollow-eyed, stared at his plate as though it concealed some further treachery. Holmes, however, appeared invigorated by the night's events. He ate little but observed much, his sharp gaze passing from face to face with quiet scrutiny. At last he set down his cup and spoke with deliberate calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, the question before us is not merely who stole the keys, but why. 6 brass keys of no apparent use, yet so fiercely pursued that the thief risked discovery twice. Such zeal is not born of whim. It is the fruit of motive, and motive, once understood, will point the hand as surely as a compass points north." Graves shook his head wearily. "I tell you, Mr. Holmes, I know nothing of their purpose. They were my father's and his before him. He never confided their meaning, only that they must be kept safe." Holmes regarded him closely. "Then your father believed them valuable, though not in coin, perhaps in secrecy. Recall, Watson, the fragments we salvaged from the hearth. Ledger, shipment, words of commerce, not sentiment. Suppose the keys are tied not to doors but to accounts. Ledgers kept hidden, shipments concealed. Such mysteries are rarely domestic. They are matters of trade, of profit, and too often of crime." A silence followed, broken only by Mrs. Ashcombe's cool voice. "So now you accuse our father of some hidden villainy? Have we not enough trouble without staining his memory with your suspicions?" Holmes bowed slightly. "I accuse no one, madam, but I remind you that truth does not tarnish, it only illuminates. If your father guarded these keys with such ferocity, then they open not doors but knowledge, and knowledge, I need not remind you, is power." Fletcher spoke then, his voice trembling. "Sir, might it be that these keys fit not locks of wood or iron, but some chest or cabinet long forgotten? I have often wondered." He broke off, flushing under Graves's sharp glare. Holmes allowed himself a faint smile. "A fair thought, Mr. Fletcher, and one I intend to test. But let us press further. Whoever sought these keys not only stole them, but returned when false ones were set in their place. That is not the act of a thief hoping to profit from brass alone. No, our intruder sought certainty, proof that what was lost might yet be regained. The motive, Watson, is not theft for gain, but theft for silence. They fear what these keys might reveal." The words seemed to strike a chord in Graves. He rose suddenly, pacing with agitation. "But silence of what? Of whom? I tell you I know nothing, nothing." His voice broke into a hoarse whisper. and yet I feel as though a shadow, long hidden, has risen to claim me." Holmes watched him with sympathy, then turned to me. "Mark this well, Watson. The crime grows ever clearer. The thief is no random marauder. They are bound to this family, to its history, to secrets buried with its patriarch. The keys, the papers, the midnight light, the prowler, all point inward. The motive is not possession, but prevention. Someone fears discovery more than they fear the gallows." Later, as we walked in the garden, Holmes leaned close. "Do you see, Watson? The impossibility of the crime is but a veil. The true puzzle lies not in how the keys vanished, but in why. Until we grasp that, every step is shadow. But with last night's attempt, the shadows are thinning." He paused, gazing at the shuttered study window. "The next move, Watson, will not be theirs but ours, for once we know what truth they guard, we shall know the thief who trembles at its unveiling." Chapter 11. The Bait. Holmes spent the greater part of that day in a state of unusual activity, moving briskly between the study, the garden, and the hall with scarcely a word to any of us. He examined the locks again, scrutinized the window bar with his magnifying glass, and spent an inordinate time measuring the spacing of the bureau drawer. From his coat pocket he produced lengths of twine, a small vial of chalk, and a roll of thin paper, which he employed with a concentration that made me recall his days of chemical experiment in Baker Street. At last he drew me aside. "Watson, we must act decisively. Twice the thief has moved under cover of night. Twice they have slipped our grasp. The next attempt must be their last." "You mean to set a snare?" "Precisely. Observe." He showed me the drawer, now containing not the false brass rods of yesterday, but a packet wrapped in brown paper and sealed with wax. Upon it he had scrawled, in his sharp hand, the words, "Graves' Ledger." "Keys required." "An invention," he explained, "but one that will serve. The thief, believing they have erased the evidence by burning the papers, will not resist this bait. They must look inside. Curiosity will compel them, and in so doing, they will spring the trap." "And what trap have you laid?" Holmes smiled thinly. "A strip of thin paper beneath the drawer, dusted lightly with chalk. When the drawer is opened, the paper will tear. The chalk will adhere to the fingers of whoever handles it. Simple, perhaps crude, but undeniable. By morning we shall know whose hands betray them." That night, the atmosphere in the house was taut with expectation. Graves retired. Early, his nerves frayed by sleeplessness. His sister remained in her chamber, or so she claimed. Fletcher lingered uneasily in the hall, while the servants went about their duties in silence. Holmes and I concealed ourselves in a small antechamber adjoining the study, the door cracked just enough to watch the bureau by the light of a shaded lamp. Hours passed in stillness, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Holmes sat utterly motionless, his eyes never leaving the desk. Midnight came and went. The house groaned and settled in its timbers. The wind pressed faintly at the shutters, and I began to doubt that anyone would dare approach. Then at last the faintest whisper of footsteps along the corridor. Slow, deliberate, pausing once as though to listen. The handle of the study door turned, and a shadow slipped inside. Cloaked in darkness, the figure moved straight to the bureau. I felt Holmes's hand tighten on my arm. The figure bent, drew the drawer softly open, and reached for the packet. A faint rip of paper, almost imperceptible, told me the trap was sprung. The packet was lifted, examined for a few seconds, then returned with care. The drawer slid shut. The figure turned, and just as silently departed the room. Holmes rose, his eyes blazing with triumph. "It is done, Watson. By morning the chalk will have left its mark. We need only observe, and the culprit will reveal themselves in the most ordinary act, a hand placed upon a cup, a gesture upon a chair. Deception may weave clever webs, but it cannot escape the simplest stain. He extinguished the lamp, and we returned to our vigil with renewed intensity. For though we had not yet seen the thief's face, Holmes was certain the dawn would bring it into the light. Chapter 12. The Moment of Recognition. Morning arrived like a blade through fog, sharp, cold, and expectant. The household gathered late, the weariness of disrupted nights evident on every face. Mrs. Partridge served tea in silence, her eyes flicking from Holmes to Mr. Graves, who looked pale and drawn. Anna entered quietly, setting toast upon the table before withdrawing to her corner. Fletcher arrived last, his coat hastily buttoned and his hair unkempt. Holmes sat calmly at the far end, his gaze distant but attentive. His fingers tapped lightly against the porcelain of his cup, as though keeping time with a silent rhythm. I knew the look well. It was the waiting before the strike. He spoke gently. "I hope you all slept better than I did. There's something about an unsolved puzzle that keeps the mind in motion," Graves muttered. "I have ceased to hope for sleep at all." Fletcher poured himself tea, his hand trembling slightly. "Has anything been discovered?" Holmes smiled faintly. "We shall see soon enough." And then it happened. Mrs. Ashcombe reached across the table for the sugar spoon. As she did, her left hand passed into the light slanting through the window, and Holmes stiffened. There, upon her pale skin, just beneath the knuckles, was a faint grey smudge, chalk dust, barely visible, yet unmistakable to an eye trained to see the smallest truth. Holmes said nothing at first. His gaze lingered a moment longer, then shifted smoothly back to his tea. He waited. Moments later, Mrs. Ashcombe brushed at her hand absently with a napkin, as though aware, on some unconscious level, that something clung there. The gesture sealed it. Holmes leaned toward me and murmured, "You saw it?" "I did," I whispered. "Clear as ink on snow." He nodded once, then rose slowly, addressing the table in a voice calm but heavy with purpose. "Ladies and gentlemen, I must ask for your indulgence. Last night someone entered the study again. The drawer was opened, a package examined, a trap sprung. All heads turned. Graves's spoon fell from his hand. Fletcher's face went rigid. Mrs. Partridge gasped audibly. Holmes's eyes settled on Mrs. Ashcombe. I have set no accusations before this moment, but now the evidence speaks for itself. The one who touched that drawer carries upon their skin a mark no water can fully hide, a simple powder, a harmless dust, but enough. Mrs. Ashcombe's eyes narrowed. "You suggest that I suggest nothing, madam," Holmes said gently, "except that you extend your hand." A silence, cold and absolute. She did not move. Graves whispered, "Eleanor." Her eyes met his, unreadable. Then, with the grace of someone already weary of resistance, she laid her hand upon the table. The smudge, though faint, was visible to all. No one spoke. Holmes bowed his head slightly, as though in respect. "It is not guilt we now weigh, but purpose. That is what remains to be uncovered." She rose. "Then perhaps we should speak privately, Mr. Holmes, you and I." He gestured toward the study door. "As you wish." They left together. The door closed softly behind them, leaving the rest of us in a silence too thick for breath. Graves sat unmoving, his eyes locked upon the handprint that remained on the tablecloth. I could scarcely believe it. The composed, intelligent, unflinching Mrs. Ashcombe, sister to the master of the house, guardian of his affairs, now exposed by the faintest trace of chalk. But Holmes had not yet spoken her crime. That I knew would come soon, and with it the reason why anyone would dare steal 6 keys that opened nothing and everything. Chapter 13. The Final Attempt to Escape. The study was dim when Holmes closed the door behind us, the fire reduced to embers and the smell of char still lingering in the hearth. Mrs. Ashcombe stood by the bureau, her figure erect, her expression calm, but sharpened with something steely. Holmes, for once, allowed silence to stretch between them, as though granting her the first move. "You're a clever man, Mr. Holmes," she said at last, her voice even. "But cleverness is not always wisdom. You have caught me with a smudge of chalk and called it proof. Very well, I touched your ridiculous packet, and why should I not? Curiosity is no crime." Holmes's eyes gleamed. Curiosity alone does not drive one to enter a locked study in the dead of night. Nor does it prompt the destruction of papers. The ashes tell their tale, Mrs. Ashcombe, just as clearly as your hand. Her lips curved in a thin smile. Ashes? Scraps of paper that could belong to anyone? You ask much of shadows, Mr. Holmes. I felt my temper rise. Madam, you cannot deny you were there. We saw the mark plain upon your skin. She turned her gaze on me, cool and unwavering. Doctor, a woman may brush against many things in the course of a day. Chalk, dust, powder. Is it so remarkable you take your detective's word as gospel, but the world is less certain than he would have you believe? Holmes remained unshaken. And yet certainty has a way of revealing itself at the very moment it is most resisted. You see, madam, I know what you sought last night. It was not curiosity. It was reassurance. You feared I had uncovered that which you burned. You feared the ledger, the word shipment, the secret your father carried to his grave. For the first time, her composure wavered. A flicker of unease passed across her face, quickly smoothed into defiance. Suppose I did fear it. Suppose I sought to know whether you had truly found what was destroyed. What then? Fear is not guilt. Holmes stepped closer, his voice low but cutting. Fear is the mask of guilt when it clings so tightly, but let us not quarrel over words. What matters is motive. These keys, useless in appearance, are bound to that ledger. Your father hid something you would rather keep buried. And so you reached for the only weapon you had, deception. Her eyes flashed. Weapon? Do you imagine me plotting ruin under my own roof? My brother is weak, Mr. Holmes. He lives haunted by shadows. If I act, it is only to protect him from himself, from his obsessions, his fears. He would destroy this household with his fantasies if left unchecked. Then it is protection you claim? Holmes asked softly. Yes, she said quickly, too quickly. I took the keys to end his torment. I burned the papers so their nonsense would not consume him. That is all. For a moment, her voice rang with conviction, and I confess I felt the sway of her argument. But Holmes's expression did not alter. He studied her as one might a chessboard, seeing the shape of moves yet to come. An admirable story, he murmured, but fatally flawed. For if you sought only to shield your brother, why then return to the bureau last night? The keys are gone, the papers destroyed. What remained to threaten him, unless it was something that could threaten you? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her hands, so steady moments before, twisted the folds of her gown. Holmes straightened. Your attempt to escape through words will avail you no more than your attempt to escape through shadows. The truth presses close, Mrs. Ashcombe, and when it arrives, it will not be dressed in protection, but in revelation. He gestured toward the door. Come. Your brother awaits, and justice with him. For the first time since we had met her, Mrs. Ashcombe faltered. She did not move with the poise of command, but with the reluctant steps of one whose stratagem has run its course. Chapter 14. The final clue revealed. We returned to the study where the others awaited us, the air tense as a drawn bowstring. Graves stood by the hearth, his hands clenched behind his back, while Fletcher hovered in the doorway, pale and restless. Mrs. Partridge and Anna lingered near the sideboard, whispering nervously until our entrance silenced them. Holmes guided Mrs. Ashcombe inside with quiet firmness. She took her seat with all the grace of a sovereign compelled to abdicate, her chin lifted, though her colour betrayed unease. Holmes remained standing, his lean figure outlined by the flickering firelight. "I thank you all for your patience," he began. "This case, strange as it has seemed, rests upon a single truth, a truth concealed beneath layers of fear and deception. Last night's events and this morning's evidence leave little doubt. The keys and the burned papers are bound to the same secret. And now, at last, I have the final clue that discloses what that secret must be." A murmur passed through the room. Graves's voice was hoarse. "Tell us, then, for God's sake, end this torment." Holmes inclined his head. "Very well. But first, Mr. Graves, allow me to ask, in your father's day, was there ever mention of a warehouse or a storehouse tied to his business?" Graves frowned, startled. "Why, yes, a disused building at the edge of the river docks. It has stood empty for years. My father forbade me ever to enter it. He said it was dangerous, unsafe." "Ah," Holmes said softly. "Dangerous indeed, not for crumbling timbers, but for the truth it contains. The 6 keys, Mr. Graves, are not random curiosities. They are a set, each corresponding to a lock upon that warehouse. Together they open its doors, its cabinets, its safes. That is why your father guarded them, and why your sister feared their discovery." All eyes turned to Mrs. Ashcombe. Her lips parted, but she did not speak. Holmes continued, his voice steady. "The burned papers, what little remains of them, speak of ledgers and shipments. That, combined with the warehouse, suggests transactions concealed from the world. I suspect your father dealt in goods not entirely lawful, and those records lay hidden behind those locks. If the authorities, or rivals, were ever to see them, ruin would follow. That is the shadow your sister tried to smother with fire." Graves staggered back a step, his face ashen. "No." "My father? He was stern, proud, but never dishonest." Mrs. Ashcombe's voice cut through the silence, low and fierce. "He was both. You never knew him as I did, Lionel. He traded respectability for secrecy long before you were old enough to see. I kept it from you because you could not bear the truth. You still cannot." Holmes raised a hand. "Whether guilt belongs to the father or the daughter, the fact remains. The thief's motive was never gain. It was concealment. The theft of the keys, the destruction of the ledger, the midnight prowl, all acts of one desperate to keep the past buried. And the final clue. The disused warehouse by the docks shows us where the trail must end." Graves sank into his chair, his face hidden in his hands. Fletcher stepped forward, alarmed. "Then we must go there at once, sir. We must see for ourselves what lies behind those locks." Holmes nodded gravely. "Indeed, tonight we shall gather the household, but before we set foot near that warehouse I will lay the matter plain, for secrets such as these do not die in silence, they are dragged into the light, whether willingly or not." Mrs. Ashcombe rose, her composure crumbling for the first time. "You know nothing of the cost, Mr. Holmes, nothing. If you open those doors, you will destroy not only a man's name, but a family's honour." Holmes met her gaze unflinchingly. "Truth, madam, is indifferent to honour. It demands only to be seen, and now it stands before us, awaiting no further delay." The room fell into silence again, but this time it was the silence of inevitability. I knew then that the case was nearing its climax. The mystery of the keys was almost resolved, and with it, the fate of all who dwelt under that roof. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. The following evening, as dusk fell over London, and the river fog crept inland from the docks, Holmes summoned the entire household into the study. The summons was not a request, but an order delivered with such calm finality that none dared refuse. The air was thick with unease as each figure took their place. Graves by the hearth, pale and sunken, Mrs. Ashcombe composed yet rigid, Fletcher nervous as ever, wringing his hands, Anna wide-eyed, clutching her apron, and Mrs. Partridge solid and silent, her gaze shifting between them all. I stood beside Holmes, who leaned lightly against the bureau, his hands folded, his eyes as sharp and restless as a hawk poised above its prey. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and deliberate, "we are assembled because this case can no longer endure shadows. Twice an intruder has crept into this very chamber, believing their acts concealed by night. Once to steal, once to destroy, and once again to reassure themselves that all evidence of their crime was gone. They were mistaken, for even ashes and chalk whisper the truth if one is patient enough to listen." A tremor of unease passed across the room. Fletcher shifted on his chair, Anna's lips pressed tightly, and Mrs. Ashcombe's eyes narrowed like blades. Holmes continued, his gaze moving from one face to the next. "Let us consider the facts. 6 keys vanish from a locked bureau. They are no ordinary keys, but a matched set, kept for generations, though their purpose was left unexplained. Shortly afterward, papers are burned in the hearth, scraps of which speak of ledgers and shipments. At the same time, a prowler is seen, first by the maid's account of candlelight at midnight, then by my own eyes during their second attempt, and last night my simple trap revealed the hand that touched the drawer again." He let the silence settle before continuing. "This is not the work of some common thief. It is the hand of one who knew exactly what those keys would unlock, and feared the discovery of what lay behind them. That is the true puzzle, not how the crime was done, but why." Graves stirred, his voice heavy. "And that why, you mean to tell us it lies with my father?" Holmes inclined his head. "So it appears. The warehouse by the river docks, which your father forbade you ever to enter, was the key's true destination. It is there, behind 6 locks, that the records of his dealings are hidden. Not accounts fit for daylight, but dealings kept secret from all but himself. The theft of the keys was not an act of greed, it was an act of fear. Fear that those records, if opened, would undo the name of Graves and all connected to it." A murmur rippled through the room. Fletcher whispered a prayer under his breath. Mrs. Partridge crossed herself swiftly. Anna looked as though she might faint. Mrs. Ashcombe rose, her voice sharp. "You sit there and speak as though you knew my father better than his own blood. You call his name into question without proof, only fragments and guesses. Have you no decency, sir?" Holmes' eyes fixed upon her, calm but relentless. "On the contrary, madam, I have proof enough. The ashes gave me words. The boot print gave me shape. The chalk gave me touch. Together they reveal more than your denials. For it was you who stole the keys, you who burned the ledger, you who prowled in the night to ensure nothing remained, not out of greed, but out of loyalty. To your father's memory, to the secret he left you, you feared the world would learn what you already knew." Graves stared at her, aghast. "Eleanor, is this true, that you would risk our ruin for the sake of silence?" She met his gaze with a strange calmness, though her eyes glistened faintly. I did what you could not. You are too weak for truth, Lionel. Father's legacy is poison. If those records are found, you will be destroyed by them. I took the burden so you would not have to bear it." Holmes raised a hand. "And yet, madam, by attempting to hide it, you ensured its discovery. Deception is always its own undoing. What you burned could not be fully consumed. What you stole could not be fully hidden. Truth pressed forward, as it always does." For a long moment, no one spoke. The fire hissed softly, the clock ticked in the hall, and the fog pressed like a muffled drum against the windows. Graves's head sank into his hands. Fletcher leaned pale against the doorframe, and Anna wept quietly. Mrs. Partridge alone remained upright, her arms folded, her eyes glistening with the weight of years. Holmes straightened, his voice now resonant with finality. "Tomorrow, at first light, Dr. Watson and I will accompany you, Mr. Graves, to the warehouse. The locks will be opened, the secrets revealed, and the truth laid bare. Whatever shadow your father left behind, it will no longer haunt these walls in silence." Mrs. Ashcombe turned her face away, her composure unbroken save for the faintest tremor in her hand. And so the gathering ended, each soul dismissed to a night of unrest. The truth hovered on the threshold, and though Holmes had not yet unveiled the full shape of the crime, I felt we were at the very edge of revelation. The case of the keys to nowhere had ceased to be an eccentric puzzle. It had become a reckoning. Chapter 16. The Reveal. Dawn broke grey and heavy, the sky sagging low over the Thames as Holmes, Graves and I descended into the district near the old docks. The streets here bore the fatigue of abandonment. Cobbles slick with mist, walls blackened by coal soot, and the scent of salt, rot and rust hanging in the air like a lingering breath. Holmes moved ahead in silence, his coat flaring slightly with each step, while Graves clutched the ring of 6 brass keys with fingers pale and stiff. The warehouse stood at the edge of a narrow wharf, an unmarked structure of brick and iron, with windows boarded long ago. It bore no signage, no name, only a rusted chain across its entrance, and a rust-coloured door set with a row of peculiar locks, 6 of them aligned vertically, aged but intact. Holmes examined them closely, then motioned to Graves. Each key is unique in design, yet they belong to a set, like a sequence, a ritual. One opens nothing, all 6 together open everything. Graves nodded numbly and inserted the keys in order. One by one, each lock turned with a dull click. When the 6th key yielded, the chain slacked and the great door creaked inward, revealing a cavern of dust and silence. We stepped inside. The air was cool, the scent of old timber and forgotten years clinging to every surface. Sunlight filtered in thin blades through the slats, slicing the gloom into narrow columns. Against the far wall stood a cabinet of heavy oak, banded in brass, its own locks now rendered obsolete by the ring in Graves's hand. Holmes moved deliberately, unfastening the latches. The cabinet opened with a groan. Inside lay what we had expected, ledgers, rows of them, bound in cracked leather, their spines marked only by initials and dates. Holmes selected one and opened it upon a nearby crate. We leaned in. What we saw removed all doubt. The entries were precise, coded at first glance, but unmistakable, under scrutiny. Quantities of goods shipped with vague descriptions, bulk material, import stock, alongside destinations in cities known for smuggling and black market trading. The handwriting was the elder Graves, unmistakably neat, cold, methodical. Beneath it, careful marginalia, revised figures, lists of false names, alternate ports. Holmes turned a few pages, then another book. The pattern held. "Gentlemen," he said at last, "these are the private books of a man who ran a second enterprise beneath his official business. one dealing not in cloth and timber as advertised, but in goods neither declared nor taxed. The nature of some of these entries suggests smuggling, and perhaps worse. These keys were not sentimental, they were control, power, access to the only place the truth had ever lived. Graves said nothing. He stared into the open ledger as though seeing his father for the first time. His voice, when it came, was hoarse. He made me swear never to come here. I thought it was grief, madness, but he knew. He knew if I saw this, everything would crumble. Holmes closed the ledger gently. And so the daughter took up the burden. She feared the past would eat its way into the present. She stole the keys not to profit, but to protect you from this moment. We stood in silence as Graves turned away, shoulders trembling. Holmes placed a hand on his arm but said nothing more. He allowed the grief to bloom without interference. Eventually we secured the ledgers in a leather satchel, Holmes locking the cabinet behind us. As we emerged into the morning light, the fog had begun to lift, revealing the slow current of the Thames in the distance. As we returned to the carriage, Graves spoke without looking at us. I shall not destroy them, I shall not hide it again, but I ask, please, Mr. Holmes, let me decide when the world sees this. Let me be the one to name my father's sins. Holmes gave a slow nod. It is your burden to carry or to set down, but I advise you, sir, let it not be a silent one. Secrets, once permitted to fester, return with sharper teeth. He did not speak again for the rest of the journey. That afternoon, back in the drawing-room of the Graves household, Holmes summoned the others and laid out the full truth. Mrs. Ashcombe listened in silence, her composure returned, though her eyes shimmered faintly. Fletcher sat upright, stunned into stillness. Anna wept freely. Mrs. Partridge merely bowed her head as though the answer had always been waiting, and had finally been given permission to enter. Holmes ended with a final statement. This was never a mystery of theft, but of silence. A silence passed down like inheritance. The keys were not stolen to unlock anything, but to stop them ever unlocking again. That is what made this crime impossible. It was not a crime of greed, but of protection, of misplaced loyalty. Graves raised his head, weary but unbroken. "And now?" he asked. "What now?" Holmes did not answer at once. He only said, "Now the truth belongs to you. Whether it stays locked or not is no longer my affair." Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The days that followed were among the most sombre I can recall in any of our cases. Holmes, who so often strode from triumph to triumph with little care for the aftermath, seemed unusually subdued. Perhaps it was because this affair, unlike so many others, ended not with a villain dragged to justice, but with a family forced to stare unblinking at its own reflection. Mr. Lionel Graves spent much of the next morning locked in his chamber. I heard him pacing ceaselessly above, his footsteps heavy as a man walking in circles around his fate. When at last he emerged, his face was drawn, and his eyes bore the red rims of a man who had fought a long battle with himself, and not entirely won. At breakfast he addressed us haltingly. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I have resolved the matter. The ledgers will be placed in the hands of the authorities. My father's name will not be shielded by false honor. Better it be judged by truth than left to rot in lies." Mrs. Ashcombe's teacup rattled in its saucer. "You would destroy us all, Lionel. Do you not see? His disgrace will not end with him. It will stain us. It will stain you." He looked at her with a strange calm. "Better a stain openly born than a rot festering unseen. You sought to protect me, Eleanor, but in truth you sought to protect yourself. You carried father's secret as if silence could make it harmless, but silence is what chained us." Holmes was right. It returns sharper when buried. She rose, her composure cracking. And what of me, then? Shall I be cast as the thief, the liar, the woman who prowled her own halls like a criminal? Will you let me be named in the same breath as father's sins? Holmes answered before her brother could. His voice was measured, almost gentle. The law will see only the smuggling ledgers and the names signed within them. You, madam, may be judged within these walls, but not beyond them. Unless you choose otherwise, your hand in this will remain hidden. But know this. Every deception leaves its mark, perhaps not in the courts, but upon the heart. Mrs. Ashcombe faltered, her hand tightening on the chair back. For a moment I thought she might weep, but instead she straightened, her expression freezing once more into that mask of icy poise. Then let it be so, she said. Let the world damn him, and let us carry the ashes. In the days that followed, Graves engaged a solicitor, and arrangements were made to turn the ledgers over to the police. The revelations spread slowly, then widely. The name of Graves, once synonymous with upright trade, became whispered in tones of scandal across the city. Business partners distanced themselves. Rivals seized the moment. Neighbours crossed the street rather than greet him. The honour that Eleanor had fought to protect was shattered not by exposure of her theft, but by the legacy of their father's dealings. Yet in the midst of ruin there was a peculiar sense of release. Graves himself seemed, after the first storm, strangely lighter. He spoke of rebuilding, of earning anew what his father's shadow had stolen. "I am no longer afraid of silence," he told me one evening. "The truth may hurt, but at least it does not lie." Fletcher remained at his post, steadfast as ever. Anna, though shaken, seemed comforted by Holmes's quiet assurance that her testimony had mattered. Mrs. Partridge, with her simple pragmatism, carried on as though the household had merely weathered a change in the weather. Only Mrs. Ashcombe remained brittle, her eyes distant, her speech curt, as though she lived now in a house she no longer recognized. For Holmes the conclusion was clear. "Justice is not always the gallows, Watson," he remarked, as we prepared to depart. "Sometimes it is the simple weight of truth pressing down upon those who sought to flee it. This family will live under that weight, and in a sense that is justice enough." I reflected on this as we took our leave of the Graves estate. The fog that had lingered so stubbornly over those days had at last begun to lift, revealing patches of pale sunlight over the city. Yet for the household we left behind, the fog would remain, no longer outside their windows, but within their hearts. And so it was that the case of the keys to nowhere ended, not with handcuffs or triumph, but with a reckoning that showed, more than any puzzle of locks or doors, how secrets once hidden can master a life more surely than chains. Chapter 18. Holmes's final reflection. It was several days after our departure from the Graves household that Holmes and I sat once more in our rooms at Baker Street, the familiar clutter of his instruments and monographs a welcome contrast to the oppressive atmosphere we had lately endured. The fog had lifted at last from London, and through the windows streamed a reluctant patch of spring sunlight. Holmes had sunk into his chair with the air of one who has consumed every ounce of an intellectual feast and now turns to quiet digestion. I, for my part, felt a deep need to record the events while they were still fresh, though no amount of ink could quite capture the sombre weight that lingered in my thoughts. Holmes smoked in silence for a long while, then at last spoke with that reflective tone I had come to recognize as the herald of his final summation. "It was, Watson, a case constructed of contradictions, and contradictions, as I often say, are the truest footprints of deceit. A locked bureau opened without force. Keys that opened nothing, yet everything. Papers burned, yet still speaking. A thief who returned again and again, not for gain, but for concealment. Each thread seemed disparate, yet together they formed a single tapestry. I nodded, and yet at the outset it seemed almost laughably trivial. 6 useless keys guarded with the care of crown jewels. Holmes smiled faintly. Precisely why it interested me. For when a man guards a thing of no value with such intensity, one may be certain its value lies in what it represents, not what it appears. Graves believed he did not understand his father's keys, but in truth he understood too well that their secrecy was their meaning. His sister, Eleanor, understood even better, and so she sought to keep them from ever being seen in their true light. He leaned forward, his long fingers pressed together. Let us trace it, step by step, as we might reconstruct the path of a river from its mouth back to its spring. The elder Graves had long conducted an illicit trade, concealed beneath the shell of his respectable business. The ledgers recording these dealings were locked away in the riverside warehouse. To protect them, he created 6 unique locks and 6 unique keys, which he guarded obsessively. He impressed upon his children that these keys were not to be lost. He did not tell them why, for he knew knowledge could become betrayal. And so the son inherited fear without understanding, while the daughter inherited knowledge without release. And thus, I said slowly, when the father died, the legacy became not wealth, but silence. Just so, Holmes agreed. Eleanor feared that if the keys remained, her brother, weak of nerve, though not of will, would eventually succumb to curiosity. She feared, too, that others might stumble upon their significance. When she learned that you and I had been summoned, her fear sharpened to desperation, hence the theft of the keys, hence the burning of the papers, hence the prowling candlelight at midnight. I recalled vividly the faint glimmer of that chalk smudge upon her hand. And yet she might have succeeded had it not been for your trap. Holmes allowed himself the rarest of chuckles. A simple device, Watson. No great chemistry, no elaborate machinery, only paper and chalk. And yet it caught her, for truth lies in the smallest details. The world believes detection is a matter of brilliance, but often it is only a matter of patience. The smallest inconsistency once observed grows into a flood. We sat in silence for a moment, the crackle of the fire filling the room. Then I asked, "Do you believe justice was served, Holmes? There was no arrest, no trial, only shame, confession, and ruin." Holmes' gaze turned distant. "Justice, my dear fellow, is not always found in the courts. The law is a blunt instrument concerned with punishment. But true justice lies in consequence. Eleanor will live her days under the knowledge that her efforts to conceal her father's deeds brought them instead into the light. Lionel Graves will rebuild his life with the scar of truth upon it, but also with the strength of knowing he need no longer tremble at shadows. As for their father, the grave cannot shield him from the verdict of history." He tapped the ash from his pipe. "No, Watson. Justice here is not a man in chains, but a family compelled to face the legacy it would have buried. That, I think, is punishment enough." I could not deny the weight of his words, and yet I found myself dwelling not upon Eleanor's guilt, nor Lionel's grief, but upon the peculiar nature of the keys themselves. What strikes me still, Holmes, is the symbolism. 6 keys opening not doors to rooms, but doors to truth. Keys that once lost seemed to lead nowhere, and yet in your hands led everywhere. Holmes's eyes glimmered. "You touch upon the heart of it, Watson. The case of the keys to nowhere was never about brass and locks. It was about how men guard their secrets, how they dress them in absurdities to keep others from peering too closely. a locked room that opens without force, a drawer that yields nothing, a set of keys that fit no lock. These were illusions, shadows cast to disguise a greater truth. But as I have told you before, there is nothing more deceptive than an obvious fact. The fact here was that the keys opened nothing. The truth was that they opened everything. I wrote his words down as he spoke, feeling the familiar thrill of admiration. And yet, as always, I could not help but reflect on the human cost. The Graves family would never again be what it had been. The house we had left was heavy with silence, not the silence of secrets, but the silence that follows when they are stripped bare. Holmes, perceiving my thoughts as he so often did, said quietly, "Do not pity them too greatly, Watson. Pity those who live forever in ignorance of their chains. The Graves family has been forced to break theirs, painful though it was. Better that than to live imprisoned by silence." He leaned back, closing his eyes. "There will be other puzzles, other crimes, other keys to nowhere. But for now the game is over." I let the fire burn low as I finished my notes. Outside, the city hummed with the restless energy of life resuming, indifferent to the tragedies of any single household. Yet within me I carried the echo of those 6 keys, their brass glinting in memory, their silence heavier than iron. For in the end, the case had not been about thieves or smugglers, but about the weight of truth and how even the smallest object can bind a family in chains unseen. And though Sherlock Holmes spoke of justice as consequence, I knew there was something deeper still, something about how the past, however tightly locked, always finds its way into the present. Thus ended the affair of the keys to nowhere, a case at once impossible, inevitable, and unforgettable.